The autumn air hung thick over the Marchetti estate in the Hudson Valley, carrying with it the weight of old money, older secrets, and the kind of power that didn't need to announce itself. Vincent "Vinny" Marchetti stood on the terrace of his sprawling mansion, watching the sun dip toward the distant hills, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. At 63, his body still carried the strength of a man who'd fought his way to the top, though his dark eyes now held the weariness that came with decades of ruling an empire built on fear and loyalty. He held a crystal tumbler of 18-year-old Scotch, never anything less, as Blacktown cars pulled up the winding driveway. Family was gathering. This wasn't unusual. Vinny preferred to keep his world contained, controlled, predictable. His 4 legitimate children were arriving with their spouses, his grandchildren bouncing with the kind of energy that money could buy but never truly contain. His ex-wife would be there too, sitting across the table from his current wife, maintaining the careful distance that civility demanded. But there was something different about tonight's gathering. Vinny's consigliere, Michael Russo, had mentioned a surprise, something he said would test the family's unity. Vinny had laughed at that. Nothing tested his family's unity. They knew better. Still, at his age, after 40 years of running the most powerful crime family in the Northeast, Vinny had learned to pay attention to small details. Details were how men lived longer than their enemies. Inside, the dining room gleamed under chandeliers that had been imported from Italy decades ago. The mahogany table stretched nearly 20 feet, laden with food prepared by chefs who'd trained in Milan and Rome. His children, each polished and dressed in designer clothes that served as armor, took their seats. The conversation flowed with the ease of people who had nothing to prove. They already owned the room. Vinny sat at the head of the table, as he always did, surveying his world like a king examining his kingdom. His eldest son, Marco, spoke about expanding their import business into Miami. His daughter, Lucia, mentioned her foundation work with careful vagueness. His youngest, Thomas, discussed college, the closest he'd ever get to legitimate life. Everyone smiled. Everyone performed. Halfway through the first course, Michael Russo entered and leaned toward Vinny, whispering something that made the Mafia boss's jaw tighten. Vinny's dark eyes moved across the table, studying each face as though seeing them for the first time. Michael had explained that someone wanted to meet with the family, someone important, someone who had waited a very long time. Vinny rose from his chair without explanation, his family freezing mid-conversation like a record scratching to a stop. When Vinny Marchetti moved, everyone watched. When Vinny Marchetti left the room, people didn't question it. They waited. He followed Michael through the halls of his mansion, past walls lined with paintings he'd bought because they were expensive, not because he understood art. They descended into the study, where the air felt older, heavier, thick with decisions that had shaped lives. And there, standing by the fireplace, was a young man, early 30s, with dark hair and eyes that Vinny knew with sudden, sickening certainty. Eyes that looked back at him with the kind of intensity that came from knowing you were about to change everything. "Mr. Marchetti," the man said, his voice steady despite his hands trembling slightly. "My name is Daniel Marchetti. I'm your son." Vinny didn't move. He stood in the doorway like a statue, his Scotch held perfectly still, not a single tremor in his hand despite the earthquake that had just shattered his carefully constructed world. Years of conditioning, decades of training himself to show nothing kept his face blank, but inside, a war was raging. "That's not possible," Vinny said, his voice low and controlled, the kind of calmness that made experienced men nervous. "Michael, explain." Michael Russo shifted uncomfortably, and that was all the confirmation Vinny needed. This wasn't an error. Someone had investigated, planned, and orchestrated this moment. The question was why, and for whom. Daniel stepped forward, and Vinny could see it now, the way the young man held himself, the tilt of his head, the shape of his hands, features that belonged to the Marchetti line, unmistakable once you knew to look for them. It was like looking at a photograph of himself at 30 before the weight of the empire had bent him into something harder. "I know this is shocking," Daniel began, and Vinny almost laughed. Shocking. The word seemed absurdly small for what was happening. "Who is your mother?" Vinny interrupted, his mind already racing through the archive of his life, cataloguing possibilities. There had been a woman in 1992, briefly, before he'd married his second wife. There had been carelessness, a moment of genuine passion that he'd quickly buried under the demands of his criminal empire. "She's upstairs," Daniel said quietly. "In the green room. She asked to see you first, to explain." Vinny's hand clenched around his glass. His wife was downstairs, his family was downstairs, and somewhere in this house, a ghost from his past was waiting with the detonator to his carefully ordered life. "Michael," Vinny said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "no one else knows about this yet." "Only us," Michael confirmed. "Daniel arrived an hour ago. I thought it best to—" "Get him out," Vinny said to Michael, his eyes still fixed on the young man who claimed to be his son. "And get the woman out through the side exit. I want them at the safe house in Westchester by nightfall. Tell no one." "What about them?" Michael asked, glancing toward the stairs that led back up to the dining room, where Vinny's legitimate family was undoubtedly wondering about his absence. "I'll handle my family," Vinny said, and there was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't a suggestion, but an order that would be followed without question. Before Michael could move, Daniel spoke again. "Please," he said, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. "She didn't want to do it this way. She wanted to write to you, to give you time to process. But she's sick, Mr. Marchetti. She doesn't have much time left. Months, maybe. That's why she came. That's why now." Vinny closed his eyes for just a moment, a crack in his armor. Sick. Dying. And somewhere in that mortality was a woman he'd known decades ago, a woman he'd chosen not to remember, suddenly demanding to be remembered. "The green room," Vinny said, his decision made. "Michael, wait 15 minutes, then bring the woman up through the service staircase. Quietly." He turned and left, without waiting for acknowledgement, his mind already shifting gears, preparing for the performance he would have to give. By the time he reached the dining room, his face was smooth again, his expression thoughtful rather than shattered. "My apologies," he announced, retaking his seat at the head of the table. "Business. There's a small issue with one of the operations in Connecticut that Michael needed to brief me on. Nothing serious." His family nodded, accepting this as the truth because Vinny Marchetti didn't lie about things that mattered. He controlled them. He bent them, he shaped them to his purposes, but he didn't lie. Yet even as he picked up his fork and continued the conversation about Miami expansion, his mind was upstairs in the green room, facing the woman he'd spent 30 years not thinking about. The woman who'd apparently given him a son. The foundations of his empire felt very unstable. The green room smelled like old money and fresh flowers, the scent mixing into something that made Vinny feel slightly nauseated as he closed the door behind him. She was sitting by the window, and for a moment he saw her as she'd been in 1992, younger, vibrant, alive with possibilities that couldn't exist in his world. Now she was diminished by illness, her frame thin beneath the elegant dress she wore, but her eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, unafraid. "Maria," he said, her name strange on his lips after so long. "You look like a woman dying?" She smiled, but it was sad. "That's because I am. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Approximately 3 to 6 months, according to my doctors." Vinny moved to the chair across from her and sat without being invited. "Why now? Why like this?" "Because I've been giving you opportunities for 30 years. Maria said, her voice steady despite everything. "Letters to your business address that your secretaries probably threw away. Calls to numbers that I had to track down. I respected your choice to disappear from my life, Vinny. I really did. But I also had your son. You should have told me." Should have? Maria laughed, a sound that dissolved into a cough. Do you think I didn't want to? I was terrified. You were married. You were building your empire. The last thing you needed was complication, and the last thing I wanted was to put my son in danger by making him part of your world. Instead, you kept him a secret for 33 years. I protected him, Maria corrected, her eyes fierce. He's a good man, Vinny, a clean man. He studied engineering at Columbia, graduated with honors, works for a firm that builds sustainable infrastructure. He has a girlfriend who doesn't know his father is a crime boss, and friends who think his mother was a kindergarten teacher in Queens. Was? Vinny caught the past tense. I retired when he graduated college, Maria said, moved to upstate Vermont, became a consultant for educational technology, lived quietly. But I'm dying, and Daniel deserves to know where he comes from. He deserves to know his family. You're dying, Vinny repeated, the words feeling unreal in his mouth. And your solution is to bring him here? To expose him to all of this? To expose him to you, Maria corrected. To give you a chance to know your son before I'm gone. And maybe, Vinny, to give him a chance to know his father. Vinny stood and moved to the window, looking out at the valley beyond, at the empire he'd built brick by brick and body by body. I have a family, he said quietly. 4 children who know what I am, who've been raised with that knowledge. I have grandchildren who think their grandfather is a businessman. You have a son who doesn't know you exist, Maria said. And now you have a choice about what that means. The choice I had was 33 years ago, Vinny said bitterly. You took that. No, Maria said, her voice firm. I protected you from it. You were free, Vinny. Free from responsibility, free from complication, free to build whatever empire you wanted without worrying about a child. That was my gift to you. Vinny turned back to face her, and for the first time, his carefully maintained composure fractured. Anger, confusion, regret, longing. All the emotions he'd trained himself not to feel crashed through him like a wave. How much does he know? He asked finally. Everything, Maria said. About your business, about your family, about what you are. He researched you obsessively after I told him last year. He knows about your conviction in 1998, acquitted but still charged. He knows about the rumors, the accusations, the things that people say about Vincent Marchetti, and he wanted to meet you anyway. Why? The question came out as almost a whisper. Because I raised him to believe that people are complicated, Maria said. That you can be both a criminal and a father, both dangerous and human, both the man who built an empire and the man who, for one summer in 1992, was gentle and present and real. Outside, the sun had finished its descent, and the valley beyond the window was slipping into darkness. Inside the green room, Vinny Marchetti, king of his criminal empire, man of absolute control, feared by hundreds and loved by few, felt the foundations of his carefully ordered world shift beneath his feet. I don't know how to be what he needs, Vinny said finally. No, Maria agreed, you probably don't, but you could try. Downstairs, the family dinner had continued without him. This was the Marchetti way. Life went on, meals were eaten, conversations happened, questions were asked but never directly answered. His wife, Francesca, had sent someone to check on him twice, but Michael had intercepted both times with messages about extended negotiations and sensitive business matters. Everyone at the table accepted this. Everyone understood. Everyone moved on, though tension hung in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. When Vinny finally returned to the dining room, he looked like a man who'd aged a decade in 2 hours. His daughter, Lucia, noticed immediately. She had always been the observant one, the one who read people the way soldiers read maps, looking for weakness and advantage. She watched her father reclaim his seat at the head of the table, watched him pick up his fork with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly before iron discipline reasserted itself. Marco, his eldest, exchanged a glance with their consigliere's nephew, both men recognizing the physical tells of a boss confronted with something unexpected. Michael entered the dining room and signaled something with his eyes, a code that the immediate family members present understood implicitly. Something had happened, something significant, something that required preparation. Vinny waited until the serving staff had cleared the main course, until the grandchildren were distracted by their mother's promise of dessert in the game room, until the adult conversation had naturally reached a pause. Then, with the kind of calculated deliberation that had kept him alive for 63 years, he rose from his chair. The room quieted as if someone had turned off a switch. When Vinny Marchetti rose from his seat during a family meal, people understood that the conversation was about to become consequential. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that separated announcements about business from announcements about family. "Something that has just come to my attention, something that will affect this family's structure and that requires your understanding, your discretion, and your acceptance." His daughter leaned forward slightly, her mind already calculating implications. His oldest son's jaw tightened. Marco was a traditionalist, someone who believed in hierarchy and bloodline, and his face suggested he was bracing for something that would challenge both. His youngest, Thomas, looked frightened, which was unsurprising for someone who had always been sheltered from the deeper realities of their world. His ex-wife, seated 5 chairs down, looked alert, already assessing how this revelation would affect her children's inheritance. "I have another child," Vinny continued, and the words hung in the air like a court verdict. "A son. He is 33 years old. His name is Daniel Marchetti. His mother kept his existence from me all these years for reasons that are complicated and, I have come to understand, protective in their intent." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ambient noise of the house seemed to pause. The low hum of the air conditioning, the subtle tick of the antique clock in the corner, the distant sound of grandchildren laughing in another room. All of it faded into the background. "Who is the mother?" Marco asked, his voice carefully controlled. This was the critical question. If she was a nobody, a brief indiscretion, the damage could be contained. If she was connected to another family, another organization, the implications could be far more serious. "Maria Constantino," Vinny said, watching his family process the name. "She was involved with me briefly in 1992, before I married Francesca." His current wife's face remained impassive, but Vinny could read the calculation behind her eyes. Francesca had her own affairs during their marriage. They had an understanding about such things, the way most traditional crime families did. But a child represented something different. A child represented legacy, lineage, continuation. "Daniel is upstairs in this house," Vinny continued, "with his mother Maria, who is ill and whom I knew years ago. She contacted me recently because she is dying and wanted to ensure that her son was not left without connection to his family after she's gone. I have made the decision to acknowledge him as my son, as part of this family. Not in the operational way that you are," he gestured toward Marco and the others, "but in a way that is genuine and that I am committed to maintaining." "How long have you known about this?" Lucia asked, her voice sharp with the precision of a prosecutor cross-examining a witness. 90 minutes, Vinny answered without hesitation. He had learned long ago that lies told in family moments had a way of returning with interest. "Michael informed me shortly after this gathering began. I have spent the last hour with both Daniel and Maria confirming the facts and understanding the situation. And you've decided to acknowledge him publicly?" Marco's voice carried a note of something, concern, perhaps, or disapproval. "Before consulting with the family council, before determining what security issues this might present, I've decided that my blood is my responsibility," Vinny said, his tone brooking no argument. "Daniel is my son. That is not a negotiation. However, I am going to be clear about the boundaries. Daniel works in legitimate business. He is an engineer, educated at Columbia, employed in the private sector. He is not part of our organization. He does not know the operational details of our family business. He is not involved in the life, and he will be protected accordingly, but separately from our active interests. And if he becomes a liability, this from Marco, practical and hard as always. If the feds use him against us, then we handle it, Vinny said quietly, the same way we handle any liability. But I don't believe that will be necessary. Maria has raised him to be a clean person. He doesn't know about our conversations, our arrangements, our business. He knows publicly available information about me, some accusations, some conviction attempts that failed. He has made his peace with that. This is unprecedented, Lucia said, not as a complaint, but as an observation. In this family, we don't acknowledge outside children. We contain complications. We minimize exposure. This is not about precedent, Vinny said firmly. This is about choice. For the first time in 4 decades, I am making a choice based on something other than strategic calculation. I am making a choice based on the fact that I have a son and that I can, for whatever time remains, know him. The table fell silent again. Francesca rose and excused herself, disappearing down the hallway toward her bedroom with the kind of controlled dignity that suggested she was processing something that required privacy. The family watched her go, everyone understanding that her acceptance or rejection of this situation would influence how the broader organization perceived it. Michael Russo stood at the edge of the room, silent but present. His job was not to participate in family decisions, but to ensure that whatever was decided could be operationalized with minimal disruption. "I'm not asking for your approval," Vinny said, his voice taking on the edge that reminded everyone why he had survived 4 decades of organized crime. "I'm telling you what is, and I'm telling you that Daniel is to be treated with the respect that any member of this family receives. Any man who disrespects him disrespects me. Any man who threatens him threats me. Is that understood?" "Understood," Marco said, though his tone suggested the understanding was intellectual rather than emotional. The rest of the family nodded their agreement, though the energy in the room had shifted fundamentally. There were questions that had not been asked. There were implications that had not been fully explored. But those conversations would happen later, in private, with Michael and the inner council. After dinner ended and the family had dispersed to their rooms, some to process what had been revealed, others to make phone calls to associates who needed to understand that the Marchetti family structure had just been reconfigured, Vinny climbed the marble staircase to the 2nd floor. He moved past the master bedroom, where Francesca was undoubtedly preparing for a conversation that would determine whether their marriage continued on its current trajectory or shifted into something different. He moved past the guest rooms, where his children occupied themselves with the business of their own lives. He climbed to the 3rd floor, to the green room where he found Daniel alone, looking out at the moonlit valley beyond. "I don't know how to do this," Vinny said without preamble, his voice carrying an honesty that few people ever heard from him. Being a father to someone who's already an adult. Being a father to someone who is clean in a world that is not. Being a father when I have spent my entire life believing that fatherhood within this life means preparing someone for violence and compromise. Daniel turned from the window, and Vinny could see the uncertainty in his son's face, the same uncertainty that Vinny felt himself. "Neither do I," Daniel said, and there was a slight quaver in his voice that made him sound suddenly much younger than 33. "I've spent my life wondering about you. Not the crime boss, not the man the government prosecuted, but the man, my father, and I've wondered if you would even want to know me." Vinny moved to the window, the same window where he had stood with Maria only hours before, and looked out at the empire he had built through decades of ruthlessness. "Your mother said you researched me," Vinny said, "that you know what people say about me, that you know my convictions and my acquittals and my reputation." "I know the public record," Daniel said. "I know what the internet knows, but I also know that my mother loved you, at least for a time, And I've never understood how that was possible if you were the monster that some people claim." Vinny turned to face his son, and in the lamplight of the green room, father and son stood looking at each other across the gulf of 33 years. "I am a man who has spent 40 years building something that will outlast me," Vinny said slowly. "I am a man who made choices that created an empire and destroyed other people's lives in the process. I have ordered things that would turn your stomach. I have participated in violence and extortion and activities that would make you ashamed. I am a man who thought he had transcended his own humanity to build all of this." He gestured toward the valley below, toward the empire that stretched across New York and into neighboring states. "And apparently," Vinny continued, his voice dropping lower, "I am a man who fathered a son and didn't even know it, who has been given an unexpected second chance at something I thought I had already missed. Something that might exist outside of the machinery of power and control that has defined my entire life." Vinny extended his hand, and the gesture was humble in a way that no one in his organization had ever witnessed from him. "I don't know if I can be the father you need or deserve," Vinny said. "I don't have the skills for it, I don't have the practice, but I am willing to try, and I am going to ensure that you have the choice about what you want our relationship to be. Not the choice your mother made for me 33 years ago, but the choice that you make now, knowing exactly who I am and what I represent." Daniel took his hand, and Vinny felt something shift inside his chest. Not redemption. He was far too realistic and too honest with himself to believe in redemption. But perhaps a different kind of power. The power of connection that wasn't transactional. The power of continuation that wasn't built on violence or fear. The power of genuine human relationship in a life that had been defined by the absence of such things. They stood together in that moment. Two strangers connected by biology and genetics, and the kind of accident that happens when people make choices without understanding the consequences. Downstairs, in the master bedroom, Francesca was composing a phone call to her lawyers, already beginning the calculations about what this revelation meant for her position within the family. In Marco's room, the eldest son was considering how to use this knowledge, whether it would strengthen his position or weaken it, whether his father's moment of human vulnerability represented an opportunity or merely a distraction. Outside, the New York night wrapped around the mansion, holding its secrets, protecting its shadows, indifferent to the small revolutions happening within its walls. Inside, a crime boss and his son sat together in the green room. Two people who shared nothing but blood and circumstance, attempting to bridge the gap that decades and different worlds had carved between them. And somewhere down the hall, in a guest room with soft lighting and careful temperature control, a dying woman smiled in her sleep, knowing that her son would no longer be alone in the world when she was gone. Knowing that despite everything she had feared, everything she had tried to protect him from, Vinny Marchetti was at least willing to try. Knowing that in the Marchetti family, where everything was transactional and every relationship was built on power dynamics, this small acknowledgement, a father admitting his own uncertainty, a father willing to surrender some of his control, was perhaps the most revolutionary thing that had ever happened within these walls.